think, the first thing that you need to get really specific on are, there can be a lot of symptoms of having a gut dysregulation or having gut issues or imbalances. The biggest telltale sign is your poo, right? And it's my favorite topic to talk about. There's something called the Bristol stool chart where you can look and you can actually rate your poo. Essentially, you can see, okay, what type of poo do I have? Is it mushy? Is it PC? Does it break apart in the water? That's certainly a sign of degree of diarrhea or looser stools, which has a root cause. The ideal poo, if you want like gold star poo, is when you have almost like a log, right? So it's all in one piece. It comes out in one piece. It stays fully formed like a sausage, right? What a great analogy. And there's some variation of that. It can have cracks on the inside, but you do want it to stay together. Seeing a little bit of food, undigested food in there can be a variation of normal. But if you see a bunch of undigested food, that can be a red flag. And then, of course, people know generally when they're constipated, but having little balls, that comes out in little hard balls, that's a sign of constipation. And if you're consistently on one of those ends of the spectrum of those hard ball stools that are hard to pass or more liquid PC stools, if that's your stool every day, there's definitely something going on that needs addressing. And some people might say, well, I'm fine. It doesn't bother me that I have a squishy poo, or it doesn't bother me that my poo comes out in balls. So is it a big deal? And the answer is, yeah, it absolutely is. That is just the body's way of saying, like, well, it's, there's more things at play, but that's a big sign from the body saying, hey, things are not optimal. Like something is wrong here and you need to pay attention. But most people just flush it without looking. And I encourage all of my clients to like turn around, make some notes, see what's going on. Because it really can tell you so much. It's like a vital sign. Right.
Yeah. Regardless, so let's say if my diet's shifting throughout the week, because we all eat different things all the time, especially Americans, because we have so much access to different types of foods. And I know most American families or whatever have their go-tos. Like I have the food I like to eat all week, and then every now and again we'll eat out. So, but you're saying like even it doesn't always have to be the intake. So like a lot of people will blame if they have like a weird looking or a different looking poop. They'll maybe like, oh, it's because I, had X last night at the drive-through or something like that. But that's not necessarily the case, is what you're saying. It could be something within the microbiome.
Yeah, it could be. And it's different. So I'm always talking to people about patterns. So sometimes I have an Instagram message of someone panicking saying, I had a loose stool. And I say, okay, well, how long have you been having loose stools? Well, I've only had it for today. It's like, okay, well, we can calm down. We're looking at patterns. If it becomes consistently loose, and no matter what you do, that's when you start to look and say, okay, is there something deeper going on? It is a little bit normal to have, if you have a higher fat meal, so you go out for burgers and fries, then you had a milkshake with it, your body might not be used to digesting that much fat. And especially if you don't have a gallbladder, you might have some looser stools. Sometimes that'll leave streaks in the bowl. That's a sign that you're malabsorbing fat or the fat content of your stool is too high. That can be a variation of normal if it's happening every once in a while. But again, we're looking at those patterns. So as a rule, what do your patterns look like? And that can really tell you a lot about what's going on. And beyond that, again, it's not just about the stool consistency, because people can live happily with mushy poos or with hard, ball stools. That's completely normal. It's not completely normal. That can be completely fine in terms of your quality of life, but it doesn't mean it's not causing deeper issues down the line. So left unattended, if we just have loose stools for decades, that can lead to a whole host of other things. It can lead to deficiencies, because when you have loose stools or diarrhea, really what's happening, the reason that they're loose is that they're moving through your digestive tract really quickly. So whenever things move through your digestive tract, and when you think of your digestive tract, it's like one long giant tube, right? It starts up here and it ends down there, and it twists and turns along the way. The composition looks a little bit different depending on where you are. But that's what happens. It's one giant tube. And when food is going through it, as it's moving through, there is water being absorbed at all times. And that's why you stay hydrated, even if you don't drink water for the day, right? Our body is able to pull water out of the digestive tract and back into the body so that our body can use it. So what's happening when there's loose stools is things are moving so quickly through that your body doesn't have time to absorb that water, which is why it comes out in the toilet bowl a little bit loose. So you can imagine if it's moving through really quickly and your body can't even absorb the water from the stool, you can imagine what else it's not absorbing from your food. We see malabsorption of vitamins and minerals, which can lead to deficiencies, which can lead to a whole host of other issues. So again, it's not as simple as, well, I have loose stools, but it really doesn't bother me. I just have to wipe a little bit more. It really can lead to long-term issues if it's not addressed.
So one could be doing everything right, taking all their athletic greens who are not a sponsor of this, by the way, but hopefully someday.
Yeah, exactly.
But so
maybe. Yeah.
I have a bag over there. I can see it from here. It's also a bottle of vodka over there. For some reason, they're sitting next to each other. I'm in the basement, but
we'll have them sponsor.
I know Tito's or something. So one could technically, or one could be, think they're doing everything right during the day, like they're eating properly. I mean, in so much as we all do that, eating properly, getting their vitamins, taking everything spaced out, thinking like, hey, first thing in the morning, I'm going to take. I take my athletic greens first thing in the morning because I'm assuming it helps with absorption, like not on a full stomach. So one could think they're doing it right all day, and then it's not absorbing almost any of it. We have some psyllium husk upstairs because it's like the basic version of Metamucil, I guess, that we call in the States, which is Metamucil is delicious. Or whatever the commercial brand is. I could eat those little crackers all day. Speaking about the absorption thing, can a person overdo other things that may make things pass without properly getting nutrition?
Yeah, so you can definitely overdo things in terms of fiber, in terms of supplements. And honestly, I have clients come to me on 40 different supplements. And I say, okay, well, we don't even know what your body is doing on its own. We have no idea what your true symptoms are because you're taking this cocktail of supplements. And yes, they're natural supplements, but it doesn't mean that they're not causing an impact on how you feel. Or the flip side of that, we're talking about a normal poo. Sometimes I have clients who are actually constipated, but are taking magnesium citrate or something similar to have a daily bowel movement. So they say, no, my bowels aren't an issue. I'm pooping every day. Well, but it's induced by a supplement, which means there is still a root cause to identify you are constipated outside of taking that supplement. And so what's causing the constipation? That's what we're getting to, right? So supplements are a little bit of a Band-Aid approach sometimes. And that's really what sets our practice apart from other practices too, is that we understand there's a time and a place for Band-Aid approaches, but that is not a long-term fix. And that's what our traditional health system is doing with IBS and with gut issues. You go to them and you're constipated, they say, just take Miralax. Well, okay, that'll give you a daily bowel movement, but it's not fixing the actual issue of why you're having constipation in the first place. Right.
Yeah.
So that can be really probably, you can definitely overdo supplements and you can be taking the wrong supplements. I mean, even you look at probiotics and people think that they should be taking a daily probiotic, but they're not taking the probiotic that they need, or they're not taking one that is particularly useful, and it can be doing damage to their gut. Not as damaging as alcohol or, some of the standard American diet is, but it can be leading to unhealthy competition in the gut. It can be maybe you have an overabundance of the bacteria that you're consuming. Well, you don't need any more of that, but you're creating more competition. So the bugs that you do need can't grow because the seats are filled by all the probiotic bugs you're taking, right? So sometimes, what I like to do over supplementation is really look at diet and lifestyle to see how can we support your natural microbiome. Because the bugs that are growing in your gut are completely different than the bugs not completely different. They are different than the bugs that are growing in my gut. And my goal isn't to make your gut look like mine. My goal is to make sure to look at your general microbiome and the general makeup of your microbiome and say, okay, knowing what we know about your gut, how can we optimize it? Not change it completely, but how do we optimize it? And that is the approach that we take. No Band-Aid approaches, just actually addressing what's going wrong.
Yeah, well, two things. There is a South Park episode about this. I don't know if you know it or not. It's the one with Tom Brady, and you're going to have to ask your husband about it.
It's
hilarious. It's where they do, I thought the guys were making it up. It was the
Oh,
one where
was
they do
that the
the
was that
fecal
the
transplant
yes,
one.
I think
The kids on South Park were hanging out in Tom Brady's basement waiting for them to flush the toilet so they could collect his whatever they were going to sell it. But anyway, that's kind of alarming as well, because obviously we're over everything in this country, and we'll focus on this country because we're here, and this is, most people will be watching or listening to this will be here as well, even though this is it's not a problem in some parts of the world, because we tend to overdo everything. We overdo our food, we overdo our supplementation, and look, we got vitamin stores and GNCs on every corner, and you go in there and you just assume that if you take a probiotic, like anything else, I'm going to take what's recommended on there. But what you're saying is that it really should be, in so much as we can all go to a compounding pharmacy, it sounds like what should be done first is there should be some measurement of the composition or the makeup, and then something should be applied, because one could think that they're taking probiotics and everything else, and they're like, I'm doing a great job. They could be helping one thing and then hurting something else completely.
Exactly. Yeah. And it
Yeah.
really does need to be specific. So, the reason I don't give the reason we have the packages that we do in terms of we test first and then we address what's going on based on the data, is because you could line up 10 people with constipation and bloating, and they all will have a different cause. They'll have a different root cause. So I wish it was as simple as saying, everyone with constipation and bloating, take this. But in reality, it's not the case. That's not how it works. And that's why people are still suffering, because you can Google that, right? Right now, you could Google, what should I do for my constipation and bloating? And it will spit out some things to recommend. But it doesn't mean it's going to fix your constipation and bloating, because there are so many different causes of it. And so we definitely rely on our clinical judgment. We've been doing this for a really long time. We've gotten really good at looking at a general picture of a client and saying, man, it sounds really much like this. And then we can test and confirm if that is in fact the case, and then move forward with really strategic targeted treatment. And that includes nutrition changes, lifestyle changes, even addressing stress, which people will rather give up all of their favorite foods than address stress. It's wild. It's bonkers.
Yeah.
But stress is so impactful for the gut. It's impactful for overall health, but specifically the gut. And for a lot of my clients, they're doing everything right, textbook, but they are so stressed out and they won't address it.
Yeah.
And that's tricky, right? We could have we could be here for hours talking about that connection, but it really is a full body approach. And that's something you don't get from traditional medicine. Again, they do a blanket approach. They say, okay, everyone with constipation gets Miralax. They should eat fiber. They should drink fluid. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Everyone who has constipation, bloating should take Linzess. It's this one medication. It works for everybody. Well, a blanket approach works if it's a Band-Aid solution blanket approach, right? Because you're covering up symptoms. Of course, it's going to work because we have things that take away the symptom. It's not fixing the underlying cause, which means you either have to stay on that Band-Aid solution for the rest of your life, or your symptoms are going to come back.
Yeah.
Which nobody wants that, right?
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, I mean, and what do you think is it like so let's say I'm taking a whole bunch of vitamins and supplements, and I think something could be wrong. How long would one have to stop? Like, would you recommend if somebody comes to you and they say, hey, I'm taking this list of 40 things, do you have them like stop all of those things just to reset? I mean, like you're saying with all the Band-Aid solutions and everything else, because I mean, it's pretty hard to pinpoint what's going on if somebody's just on a whole bunch of stuff all the time, and that goes for anything. I mean, even even having a glass of wine before bed. I mean, there's so many things I could imagine that would go wrong. Like, what would be the length of time that I would have to stop taking all supplements, which, in the interest of trying to figure out what was going on with me, of course, planning to pick them back up again. But is there like a time period that it takes for the gut to turn over, so to speak?
Ooh, that's a good question. So the gut, your gut lining is always regenerating. Just like everything else. I mean, our skin is constantly regenerating. It's actually remarkable when you think about it. We're just like brand new beings, and in a couple months' time.
What's wrong with me then? Why?
Well, your hair isn't regenerating, but everything else is. But yeah, I mean, it's fascinating when you think about it. But in terms of supplements, when we want to see, okay, what is the body doing on its own? What are your energy levels like on its own? What are your bowel habits looking like? Usually just getting off of them for a couple weeks will really tell us what's going on. But I have clients who have been sticking hundreds of Band-Aids on themselves, just to have a daily bowel movement. And they've been taking these supplements for decades. And I have them pull off of all of their supplements, even if it's a huge, long list of them. And they say, actually felt the same. And I'm like, yeah, you've been wasting a lot of time, right? And a lot of resources on those supplements, because we're never giving the body a chance to show us what it's doing on its own. And what if it's good? But what if, and then there's the flip side of sometimes you go off of those things that are prompting a bowel movement every day, and then you don't have a bowel movement for 5 days. Okay, well, that might be your norm. There are some rebound symptoms that come, from going off things too. But as a rule, it's like, okay, you've said that you think your gut's good because you have a daily bowel movement, but it was only because of those supplements that it was happening. This is a really big problem, that you're going, once every few days, and there's definitely a reason for that.
Yeah, and I wonder, like, how much what makes up our microbiome, how much is genetic versus environment? Has there been enough studies on that? Because I imagine people in the same family with the same DNA probably have similar, if I don't know.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And I think that is something, it's a little bit of a misconception, but also really, really interesting how that works. So it's less about your genetics and it's more about your mother's microbiome. So your kind of core microbiome is determined by your mom and probably her mom. So you can think your grandma for your microbiome as well. But what's happening is, when an infant is in the stomach growing, right? From what we know right now, the stomach is sterile. There isn't any, good, bad bacteria in there. And I think maybe there's newer research perhaps that will come out and refute that, because we used to think everything was sterile and now we're like, oh, it's not, there's bacteria everywhere. But as a rule, the baby's first introduction of bacteria is the mom, if it is a regular vaginal birth. So as babies are pushed out of that vaginal canal, they're ingesting some of the mom's mucus, right? And that is what there's microbiome in that. There's bacteria in that then becomes their core microbiome. So if your mom was missing a certain population of bacteria, you probably are too. Same thing with grandma. If grandma was missing it, it probably didn't get passed down to mom, which didn't get passed on to you. We used to think that you could re-inoculate the gut. So that used to be there's a lot of people who still think that. They think, just take a probiotic and you'll be fine. Just take something with lactobacillus and then you'll have lactobacilli in your gut. And that's really not the case. We see now that people will go back to their natural core microbiome unless you have really significant diet and lifestyle changes. But if a population is completely wiped out, there's no research to support that you're ever going to get it back, which is a little bit terrifying because of all of the antibiotics that people take and our diet and lifestyle. What populations are going extinct that then we won't pass on to our offspring and then they won't pass it on. So are there going to be increased rates of IBS and gut issues? IBS, right? Yeah, probably, because these populations are really important. And there's just a lot of ways to grow those, populations. And there's a lot of ways to completely decimate them too, which is really problematic,
Yeah, no, for sure. I was just thinking, I mean, just not to spin this out of COVID, but one of my concerns, and not just my concern, but one of the concerns after COVID, and look, I get it. Everybody's got to protect themselves. I love science, but I was like, man, we are really washing and doing a lot of antibacterial stuff. And I'm like, what is this going to cause later down the road, because people need to be exposed to germs, of course, and everything like that. So what percentage of clientele, or just people that of in general, like a vaginal birth versus a C-section, like what are the differences that you're seeing there? And what would somebody who was born by C-section, like how do they deal with that? Like what's a normal course of action to kind of make them more robust in their system?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we do see differences in C-section versus vaginal birth. When you look at the microbiomes, they're completely different. So the vaginal birth microbiome very much resembles the mom's microbiome. The C-section born baby more closely resembles a skin microbiome. So, on our skin, we have a very different bacterial composition than in the small intestine, which is different than the large intestine, which is different than the mouth. Each part of the body there's different types of bacteria that inhabit that. And I think that's the wave of the future. Truly, I think there are companies who are probably in production right now who are going to start swabbing the skin to see what's growing on your skin. We're going to start swabbing, the vaginal canal to see what's growing in the vaginal microbiome, what's growing in the mouth. I think all of those, we have stool testing. Now we have ways to kind of look at the small intestine as well. Next is going to be mouth, skin, vaginal canal, right? We're going to be looking at all of that. Maybe that's a new business venture for us. We can do that because I think it's going to be huge. It is definitely coming. Mark my words.
Well, they can mail it all to
right?
you. They can ship it to you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, that's what people think I do actually, is actually take the stool samples and examine them. And I'm like, that's not how it works. But yes. So anywho, if I have a baby, my firstborn, this is nothing against C-section mamas, because my firstborn was a C-section. And of course, they're getting ready to cut me open. And my first thought is, oh no, her microbiome, I'm like, sure, cut me open and pull out my insides, but let's just worry about her microbiome. And so babies that are born C-section are more prone to allergies. They're more prone to skin irritation, like eczema. There's some really interesting research looking at adulthood and having higher incidence of autoimmune conditions and diabetes and obesity. It's really fascinating. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? There are things you can do. And it's not just a probiotic. I think we're going to start seeing more emerging research on women just before they give birth, because those probiotics, I'm like jumping around topics here,
sure.
But the probiotics, they don't re-inoculate the gut, meaning they don't stay long-term, but they are definitely there while you're taking them. So I'm thinking there's going to be this big wave of research for pregnant women and saying, okay, the last month of, if you're in your last month of pregnancy, you really need to start taking these specific bacteria, because then the baby will theoretically ingest that and it will become part of their microbiome, whether it was part of yours or not through a probiotic or not, right? It's not part of your indigenous microbiome, but it was there when you gave birth, right? It's really fascinating, I think, to see. I think we're going to see a huge wave of that as well. I haven't looked on the research in that in a while, so it's possible it's there, but it is pretty fascinating to think about. And then you have women who have group B strep and have to take antibiotics for the birth of their baby. And then you wonder, like, what's that doing, right? You're at the time that we want a really robust microbiome, are things completely decimated, right? Are the good counts down, and what is that doing for future generations? But back to kind of what you can do if you're not doomed to diabetes and obesity, your baby isn't. We really look at diet and lifestyle. So are they eating a diet that is really high in plant variety, that's high in fiber? That's obviously, they're not drinking alcohol when they're a baby, but into adulthood, alcohol definitely influences the microbiome.
Sure.
Excess sugar, excess inflammatory fats. So there's a lot of discussion about inflammatory fats, and you don't have to get so in the weeds about it, but as you want to look at your diet as a whole. So as a rule, are my kids getting fresh food, fresh meats, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains? And yeah, they're going to eat cupcakes too, right? Mm-hmm. They're going to want Sprite when they're out somewhere, 2 times a year. Like that's fine. It's all about balance there. Kids still want to be kids and eat candy on Halloween and whatever. But you're looking at, again, the patterns, kind of like what we talked about with bowel habits before. We're not looking at a single thing. We're looking at the overall pattern. But that is going to be the best way to support their microbiome. Letting them play outside in the dirt. Having pets around can actually be very beneficial for that. Not overly sanitizing. Obviously, you want them to wash their hands after they have a bowel movement. But in terms of Germex, like you mentioned with COVID, it's like we were Germexing everything. Every time I got in my car, every time I got out of my car, every move, those wipes at the grocery store. It was like, it was pretty interesting. And I have a child who was born in 2020, and things were still a little sanitizy then, and I just think, what did that do? What did that do long term? I don't know. I think we're still sure of the long term effects,
Yeah. Well, so what you're saying is we did everything wrong in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Processed food, treated overuse of antibiotics. But the good news is that we're moving forward, recognizing these things. We're catching these things. People can go through their lives and just think, whatever their poop looks like. Because the thing is, you're right. If it's consistent to them, it's like, well, that's just what it's looked like every day for the last, whatever, unless I go get, what do they call that chicken you've got there? Unless they go to Springfield to pig out on
cashew chicken.
Yeah, unless they go pig out on a cashew chicken, and then they have like a weird
Yeah.
experience. But you're right. Unless there's something alarming or there's an illness, most people wouldn't even think to check that out. So are there stool tests available for at home? I know they do the Cologuard thing that's more for cancer screenings and everything else. Like, what would be the process for somebody to have their microbiome checked out? Does it have to be a stool test? Is there another way to do it? Like, what's the process there?
Question. Yeah. So it does need to be a stool test. Yeah. That's the only way we're going to see what's actually growing or not growing in your gut. And there is a lot of criticism about stool tests. And I will tell you, none of them are perfect. There is no perfect stool test. The ones that we use, not perfect. But what we do is we understand what are the limitations of this test. What are the things that tend to run high? And so when we're analyzing it, we're not looking for an A+ on the test. We're not looking for you to be absolutely perfect in every metric. And we're, just trying to get everything in the green. We're looking at overall patterns. So we're saying, okay, as a rule, you have really high gram-negative bacteria. We know that is ultra inflammatory. It increases circulating LPS, which then can travel to all various parts of the body and cause neuroinflammation, which can cause anxiety and depression. It can cause joint pain. It can cause flares of autoimmune. There's so many things there. And that's just with one example of what can be off, just that elevation of those gram-negative bacteria. We can look and say, man, you don't have a lot of good bacteria. There's really not a ton there. So then they can't produce those short chain fatty acids, which are really beneficial for the gut lining and very anti-inflammatory for the gut. So again, we're looking at patterns. There's also, a criticism I hear a lot, specifically from from traditional medicine doctors, is that we just don't know enough yet. Well, I don't know. I would really argue that, because we know a whole heck of a lot. Now, do we know everything? Absolutely not. What we know about gut health is still in its infancy, but we know a ton about these different types of bacteria in the gut. Are there, species that we still haven't even identified? Absolutely. There is so much going on in the gut that we don't know. But what we do know can really help people, and it does. If they were not a useful tool, we would not see the outcomes that we do with our clients. We wouldn't see, okay, this is your dysfunction. It absolutely matches with your symptoms. And then we move forward with a personalized, specific treatment protocol for them, and then their symptoms improve. So yes, we don't know everything, but we definitely know enough to get people symptom resolution. Right. So I think there's, the technology is still newer in terms of testing. We've been testing cholesterol for decades, right? And we've only been looking at stool for a short period of time. So I think we're going to continue to see increased technology with that. I think the key with stool testing is, please do not order it on your own and try to interpret it on your own, because it is so complex. And I don't even know if you can. I think you can. I think they have direct to consumer tests, but you really want to partner with a practitioner who understands what they're looking at, and making sure that your practitioner isn't going to just use supplements to fix what's going on, because it can be a Band-Aid approach, right? So you want to use mainly diet and lifestyle and, that overall wellness to really alter the microbiome for good. Otherwise, it's a Band-Aid approach.
Do you have clients all over the place, like all over the U.S.? Have you noticed by region, or even more so, like nationality, race? I imagine every subsect, because obviously people have different lineages and everything else. Yeah. Is there a big difference in that whole spectrum there?
Yeah. So personally, I haven't really tracked that, but the research absolutely supports. It's really fascinating, because there's research that, suggests that you can look solely at a stool test and composition of the gut and get pretty close at placing people in the same geographical location just by their stool and by their bacterial composition. That's fascinating. And I think it does show you, number one is our food culture, right? How clean is our food? What exposures do we have? How clean is our drinking water? That's going to play a big role. But also just general types of food that we eat, because the food that we eat is either helping good bacteria grow, helping bad bacteria grow, or killing off one or the other, right? There's different bacteria prefer different types of food. And so what are you feeding those bacteria? Which bacteria are you feeding, the good or the bad? And what does that look like long term? And, culturally, there's different types of food. Some are higher in carbs, some are higher in fat and protein. And there's different bugs that thrive in both of those types of diets.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I'm interested to check out, check and
You
see
want
if
to
you
test
could.
your poo now, don't you?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. Like I said, well, I got a Ziploc upstairs. It'll be on your way.